their neighbors.
So many messages.
Yes.
That's insane.
So little time. What happens when the people we elect to office can't agree on what's best for us? And every day, the Oregon Health Authority posts how many COVID-19 tests they've done on their website. Except, there's just one slight problem. It hasn't been accurate this entire time.
Starting to see a real discrepancy.
And how two Democrats duking it out for the top job in the Oregon State House could affect your life drastically. Here's the story.
Whew, what a Friday. Hey, y'all. Dan Haggerty here. This is The Story. Let's start by talking about some indisputable truths. How about that? I feel like that's a good place to start. I mean, these are statements that are undeniable. They're supported by science. They cannot be argued. The COVID-19 virus is extremely contagious. It spreads exponentially. That means the more people who get infected, the more likely you are to then get it. It spreads more easily indoors than it does outdoors. And next week over the Thanksgiving holiday, if you decide to host or attend a big gathering, you are then more likely to encounter the virus and take it home than people who don't. Those statements are not up for debate. And that's the kind of information that we really like to share here on The Story, on this show, the indisputable kind, the black and white kind. But honestly, you would be forgiven if you weren't sure about what to do next week. Because depending on which one of our leaders you're listening to, you're going to get a different answer.
The vast majority of Oregonians are complying with these measures. However, these measures are enforceable by law.
I think our people have the intelligence, the education, and the independence to make their own decisions. We are adults. We do not need to be treated as second-rate slaves.
Knocking on somebody's private door and saying you have too many people there. No, absolutely. That's insane.
So we got Governor Brown urging Oregonians go ahead and skip those Thanksgiving celebrations. You got future Clackamas County Board Chairwoman Tootie Smith planning to ignore that advice entirely and go ahead and throw a big bash. Then you got Republican State Rep Bill Post of Kaiser telling the governor that she has no authority to force us to stay home. Never mind what our president is saying, or the president-elect for that matter, because they are not agreeing on the subject either. We are kind of at this point right now where maneuvering through this pandemic is like one of those choose-your-own-adventure books, where some people are just listening to the people who they agree with the most. Thankfully, though, facts don't work like that. As they say, numbers don't lie. Well, unless you're here in Oregon, where now we might not even be able to trust the numbers. And that brings us to our big story. Oregon's testing discrepancy. Now, we've known for months that Oregon's COVID-19 testing is insufficient, even though it is one of the best tools that we have to fight this virus and to track this virus. But a big question throughout the pandemic is, have we been testing? How much testing actually has Oregon been doing? What is the capacity? Well, it turns out the Oregon Health Authority doesn't really know, but that's not really the most problematic thing that we found out. See, earlier this week, our Pat Doris did some old school reporting, some listening and asking some good follow-up questions, and then he broke some pretty big news. He uncovered some astounding information about how the OHA counts tests. See, you probably assumed, like I did, that OHA counts every single test administered. For example, if you go to their website, you can see they have administered more than 990,000 total tests. It's right there in black and white. They use the word total. One issue, they don't actually count total tests. They only count first-time tests. Let me explain. See, if you were to get tested in October and it turns up negative, and then you get retested in November, they only count your first test. Even though you've taken two, they've only counted one. So this means OHA has potentially been undercounting tens of thousands of tests. Now, after Pat broke this story, OHA said that it plans to change the way that they do things and count tests. But I wanted to ask Pat why this is such a big deal.
Pat, explain it to me. What does it mean that we have been undercounting these tests exactly?
Well, basically, if you had 2,000 people that came to get tests all across the state today, for example, and 500 of them had had a test a week or a month before, they wouldn't count 500. And so then at the end of the day, when they say, well, how many people were positive out of that 1,500 that we are going to count, that's what they would do. And that artificially raises the positivity rate statewide. And so that's a big deal.
I feel like it doesn't give us, the old way doesn't give us that realistic snapshot of what we are looking at from day to day. Why were they doing it that way? Did they explain that to you?
Well, they did in a very short, kind of subtle way, and they said, well, it's because that's the way our infectious disease computer system was set up way back in the day. It's to track people as cases grow, and that's all they said, and then they moved on. I think it's because it's an antiquated system, probably, state government, and nobody ever imagined that you would need to be tracking 1 million people getting a test.
Right. So if things change, they're supposed to change now, the way that we kind of track and report these numbers. What does that mean for us?
Well, that means that from now on, if 2,000 people come in on one day to get a test, they'll count all 2,000 people. And the effect is it's already cut the positivity rate in half. So it went from 13% of all the people tested in one day being positive. Now it's down to about 7%. And that's a big deal because that metric is what's used statewide to decide things like when schools can open. And it's also used to think about when businesses should be curtailed. So it's a huge number.
All right. Pat Doris, as always, thanks for the explanation.
Now, obviously, the person with the most weight to throw around here in our state of Oregon is our governor. I mean, her words have real power during this state of emergency. So today, Maggie Vespa got this chance to have a 10-minute one-on-one interview with Governor Brown and managed to get some real eye-opening answers about this testing confusion and about our 2-week freeze and whether she thinks you should actually call the cops on your neighbors. I talked to Maggie about the conversation earlier.
Okay, Maggie, so let's get started with this whole testing fiasco. What was the governor's reaction to that?
So her reaction is that in her mind, it's not a fiasco because both methodologies, she says, are approved by the CDC. And she says the one that we used to use until today, apparently, was a better fit for a while. So here's her answer.
And that worked at the beginning of the pandemic. I would argue that it's not the best measure for now. So in my mind, it makes sense for us to be counting and reporting to the public how many tests we're actually doing. That's what we're going to be doing moving forward. I do think that moving to this new methodology makes sense at this time so that we have a better sense of what's happening on the ground.
Why does it make sense now?
Because I will say that we've been criticized for not testing enough when if you're only counting the person, you don't get an accurate measure of the number of tests that are happening. But I also have to be really, really clear. Testing's not the silver bullet. It won't end the pandemic.
Okay, let's talk about the freeze for just a minute because there has been a ton of pushback. What's your reaction to all that?
So the governor's reaction was definitely strong today. I read her quotes from Oregon politicians and from law enforcement, including the now famous Fox News appearance by Clackamas County Chair-elect Judy Smith. She said the freeze made Oregonians, quote, second-rate slaves in their own homes. And then also the Marion County Sheriff's Office today put out a statement saying, quote, we recognize that we cannot arrest or enforce our way out of the pandemic. So again, I read all of that to Governor Brown and I just said, what's your response?
Look, all of this is irresponsible. These are politicians seeking headlines, not public servants trying to save lives. My top priority as governor is to keep Oregonians healthy and safe. That's where I'm focused. We continue to make decisions based on science and data, and we want to make sure that Oregonians can access healthcare, whether it's hospital beds or a nurse or a doctor when they need it. So that's why we're moving forward with these common sense measures that are based on science and data.
Let's talk about the big question through all of this, though, enforcement. The governor seems to be taking this very seriously, making what appear to be threats, I guess, to people who are going to potentially break these rules. But how hard will the state actually enforce these guidelines?
Sure. So this was arguably the biggest moment in the interview. I asked Governor Brown point blank, yes or no, should Oregonians, in your mind, be calling the police on their neighbors who are violating the restrictions of this freeze, aka having more than 6 people in their home at once? Should they call the police in those circumstances? Yes or no? Here's what she said.
Look, this is no different than what happens if there's a party down the street and it's keeping everyone awake. What do neighbors do? They call law enforcement because it's too noisy. This is just like that. It's like a violation of a noise ordinance.
That could be a yes.
Yes. But honestly, they shouldn't have to. This is about saving lives, and it's about protecting our fellow Oregonians. It's about protecting our families. It's about protecting our vulnerable community members. And frankly, it's about protecting the entire state of Oregon.
All right, Dan. So as you said at the top, we had 10 minutes on the dot with the governor. The entire thing right now is up on our YouTube page if people want to check it out.
10 minutes well spent, if you ask me. Thanks, Maggie.
So, on one hand, you've got Governor Brown encouraging people to call the cops on their neighbors who break the rules, like a very contagious noise complaint type of thing. On the other hand, though, you've got powerful Republicans like State Representative Bill Post from Kaiser, who says, and I quote, "That's insane."
Knocking on somebody's private door and saying you have too many people there. No, absolutely. That's insane. And there's no way. It's not just that it's not constitutional. It's not even common sense.
All right, but let's talk about that first thing he said there. Is this constitutional, these orders the governor is giving? I guess we'd have to, I don't know, ask some type of law professor about that.
So first of all, thank you for speaking to us today. And what's your impression of her decree to begin with, that she's kind of dictating what people do in their own homes?
So the courts haven't recognized any legal weaknesses in the governor's executive orders yet. As you know, litigants have tried to challenge her authority under the emergency statute, and so far the Oregon Supreme Court has upheld her use of emergency authority. There is a question that hasn't been pressed quite as far, I suppose, which is what kind of individual rights protected by the Constitution might a defendant, in the kind of case you're describing, be able to assert against the governor's orders. One right that comes to mind is freedom of association, which is part of the First Amendment. And that has been held to protect your ability to associate within your home with whom you would like to associate. But there are limits to that right. So we haven't really seen the limits of the government's power with respect to freedom of association pressed quite as hard as perhaps we will with this order.
What do you think of her comparison to reporting a large party over Thanksgiving as being compared to calling about a loud party at any other time during the year?
Well, I see why she thinks they're analogous, because under her order, she is banning those kinds of large parties. I think the interesting question will be whether law enforcement chooses to take those calls and chooses to prioritize those calls in terms of responding. The one thing that is difficult for the governor to do is to direct local law enforcement in terms of how they prioritize their response to a car accident versus 10 people over at somebody's house for Thanksgiving. The government has well-recognized police powers, meaning the power to regulate for the health, safety, welfare, and morals of society. And Governor Brown is exercising that on behalf of all of Oregon, pursuant to this delegation from the legislature. And usually the government doesn't push that authority quite this far. So what's unique here is just how far it's being pushed into something that was never previously regulated, how many people you could have at your house for Thanksgiving. So we don't have a lot of precedent on whether freedom of association would stop the enforcement of this kind of order. There's certainly an argument that could be made, but a court would have to weigh what's more important, the police power of the state to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the population versus people's autonomy in deciding with whom they associate.
You know, the interesting thing about some of these segments we do is they often answer some questions and then just create a whole bunch more. So if you have more questions right now, I'm sure you do. I have some. Send them our way. Use that hashtag #HeyDan. You can also reach out on email at thestory@kgw.com. We're listening, and we'll do our best to find you the answers.
Every time people of color come into the Capitol, literally or figuratively, they're on their knees.
One of the most powerful Democrats in Oregon has her eyes on the top job in the House. And if you're wondering why that matters to you at all, don't worry. We'll tell you when the story continues.
Hey, welcome back to The Story. Keep your questions and comments coming. Grab your phone. Use that hashtag #HeyDan. You can email us at thestory@kgw.com. I usually read a few of your comments at the end of the show. Let's talk politics. Why don't we specifically the Oregon legislature, because there is a battle happening there right now. I know it's hard to keep track of all this stuff with everything else going on, but you know, this battle is kind of different because it's not between Democrats and Republicans. It's between these two Democrats. Representative Janelle Bynum is challenging House Speaker Tina Kotek for her leadership position. See, Kotek's been the Speaker for 7 years now. She's been reelected every 2 years by her own party. And until Bynum threw her hat in the ring, everyone pretty much assumed that Kotek was going to be a shoo-in once again. But before we get into all this, I want to explain to you why it matters and why you should care. See, the Oregon House Speaker is an incredibly powerful position. They control basically the legislative agenda in many ways, and that means what bills get introduced and what gets voted on. And right now, with the Democrats holding a supermajority, that means that they can control basically what gets passed. So if there's something you really care about, maybe it's homelessness or healthcare or racial justice, see, the Speaker plays a big part in deciding whether our lawmakers focus on that. So let's take a look at why Bynum is challenging Kotek and what it really could mean for Oregon politics.
So we're watching something that's happening that hasn't really happened very much in Oregon history. So it's a kind of an interesting moment.
Our KGW political analyst, Len Bergstein, says usually these kinds of battles within parties play out behind closed doors. But now this one's right out in the open. On Monday night, Democrats did meet privately to pick a nominee for Speaker, and at that point, only Kotek put her name forward. She got the nomination from her party, but according to the Oregonian, did not secure all 31 votes she needed to be reelected when the full House votes in January. And that's when Bynum announced she'd be challenging.
It must mean she's going to try and go get some votes from the Republicans, which means that she'll have to have some sort of power sharing with the Republicans. They'll want something.
That could mean Republicans getting control of a committee or getting a bill passed that they really want. That's not something Democrats expected to have to concede with their current supermajority. Here's what Bynum told us when we asked her why she wanted to be House Speaker.
Every time people of color come into the Capitol, literally or figuratively, they're on their knees. It's not from a position of power. It's not from a position of how can I add to the conversation. It's always a very, it's from a position of need, deep, deep, deep need. And I felt that I wanted to change that perspective. I wanted to make sure that people always felt that they knew that the Capitol was their house, that they could make demands of it from a position of strength.
Right now, she's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, which is a pretty powerful position. This year, she's been a driving force for passing police accountability laws. But that's not her only agenda. As Speaker, she says she would focus on mental health, housing, help for small businesses, and graduation rates for communities that are suffering.
And I think that just comes from knowing that someone is there who is friendly to their cause, who understands the needs of communities of color, rural communities, marginalized communities.
Despite her record on police reform, Bynum has taken more moderate positions than Kotek on some issues. And she says, as a rule, she always works across the aisle whenever she's trying to get a bill passed. Kotek didn't give us an interview, but released a statement on her nomination that didn't mention Bynum's challenge at all. It says in part, "I'm honored to have the support of my caucus to continue serving Oregon and the chamber as House Speaker. Like every business and family in Oregon, the legislature has been moving from crisis to crisis since February. I remain committed to continue working with every member to help all parts of the state to solve these immense challenges." Earlier this week, Kotek called for a special session in December to focus on economic recovery. Her office also pointed to her accomplishments as Speaker. Over the past year, those include passing the Student Success Act, paid and family medical leave, rent stabilization, Medicaid funding, and police use of force reform. But some are wondering exactly how long Kotek is going to stick around.
So there's a question about whether she might be an attractive candidate for the Biden administration. And so if people start thinking, well, gee, maybe there's a power vacuum kind of evolving. And so people are trying to get in line.
We asked Bynum about that. Here's what she said.
You know what I think is the bigger factor is the gubernatorial election that's coming up in 2 years.
She didn't elaborate, but we know Kotek's name has been floated as a candidate in 2022 when Governor Kate Brown's final term ends.
Now, since we're talking about our state lawmakers, I want to address kind of a misconception that we hear from people a lot. It centers around how much our representatives get paid. See, in Oregon, they're not bringing in the big bucks, and not even close, really. State senators and representatives make a little bit more than $31,000 a year. The Senate president and House Speaker, they make twice that, but it used to be even lower before they gave themselves a pay raise in 2019. Back then, senators and representatives made less than $25,000 a year. Interestingly enough, most of the staff who work for them, they actually make pretty decent salaries. Some of them are in the six-figure range. Now, this probably sounds like good news to people who think that politicians are overpaid with our tax dollars, but some actually argue that this limits who can be an elected leader in this state. See, former Senate Majority Leader Ginny Burdick told OPB last year, because of the low pay, we are automatically screening out people who really should be represented here. Now, see, what that means is the only people who can actually afford to be a lawmaker are people with another source of income or who are independently wealthy, or maybe they're retired and they have some money saved up. Many of our lawmakers do have second jobs or fit into one of those other categories. All right, we're going to be right back with some of your comments. Keep sending them our way. All the ways to contact us are on your screen right now. That hashtag HeyDan works pretty well. So does email, the story at kgw.com. We're going to finish this thing up next. All right, this is the end of the story. Let's talk about some comments. James Young-Liebgett wrote in and said, be careful how you interpret things. Governor Brown didn't tell people to go out and call the police on their neighbors. And this kind of echoes something that Paula Stewart wrote in on Twitter and said, the governor did not encourage people to call the police. Encourage being the word here. She said that you have the right, but did not encourage it. Be clear, please. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and push you to Maggie's full 10-minute interview on our YouTube channel right now, because Maggie asks her, are you asking people to call police on your neighbors? Then she kind of gives a long answer, and Maggie says, that sounds like a yes. And she then says, yes. So you can use whatever words you want to describe that. That is what the governor said. Again, if you want to come up with your own feelings on it, watch the full interview. I'm also going to echo that to AP Mercury, who said, hey, Dan, why didn't you ask the governor what is being done to help businesses and service industry workers while they suffer without adequate income? That's what matters. So Maggie did. It's on the YouTube channel. Check that out, too. But it does matter. But so does accurately reporting the data that we are basing those closures on. And so does the governor's powers to mandate what she's mandating and our understanding of what she can do. That matters too, and it definitely matters to what we're seeing play out with some of our businesses. And lastly, Nick Gross said, what about Tootie? I'm here for Tootie. I've been trying to talk to Tootie for a couple of days now, and I'd really like to hear from her too. I'm still waiting. I'll keep reaching out. Maybe she'll say yes to an interview. That could be fun. That's the story. Hope you had fun tonight. I did. It's Friday, man. I'll see you back here on Monday. Enjoy yourselves. Have a good weekend.